Open the door!
Seraphine, identify the threat.
Something inside her is waking up. Do not let him enter. You will die if he stays outside.
Unauthorized entry will result in immediate execution.
Elias, close it. She is not alone. He already knows who I am.
Who is speaking through you?
I got the posting on a Wednesday morning, which I remember less for the day than for what the day smelled like: the solvent they used on the integration hall floors twice a week. Sharp and medicinal. The kind of smell that takes up more space than it deserves in a room with no windows. I had been sitting outside Clerk Barrick's desk for close to 40 minutes when he finally picked up the card from the outgoing tray and held it across the desk without looking at me. The card had 3 lines. Third daughter's residential suite. Dawn Wright Ceremonial Guard. East Wing. Report 900 to the anteroom. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Barrick. Dawn Wright Detail, I said. He glanced up. He was Cerealian, third-tier administrative caste, with the flat institutional patience of a man who had answered the same questions too many times to bother inflecting his answers anymore. Residency directive requires core presence at all formal rites in the sovereign household, he said. The third daughter's suite is the only residential posting without a confirmed rotation, because it turns over, I said. He looked at me the way he looked at everything levelly, without emphasis. The rotation has not been formalized, he said. Report to the anteroom at 900. The senior keeper will meet you. I took the card and folded it into my breast pocket and didn't say anything else. 17 years in the integration corps teaches you several things. One of them is that the gap between a posting you want and a posting you don't want is smaller than it seems on the morning you receive the card. A post is a post. You stand it. You keep your attention on the work directly in front of you rather than on the work you might have preferred to be doing instead. And eventually, one way or another, something else comes along. I had been on the integration detail for 5 months since my transfer from the Vithas Transit Hub. In that time, I'd done 2 weeks in the First Prince's Gallery corridor on a formal reception rotation that had kept me busy enough not to think too hard about what I was doing. 4 days in the ceremonial kitchen annex covering a supply inspection that smelled better than I'd expected. A week and a half on the outer perimeter colonnade in weather the Cerealian calendar called autumn, and which I would not have called that. 3 days standing in the second daughter's residential corridor while 2 separate households moved furniture past me, and nobody addressed me as anything other than a minor spatial inconvenience. None of those had been the postings of a person whose career was climbing. I had stopped measuring my career against that particular standard somewhere around year 12. The Dawn Right Guard detail at third daughter's suite was the same as the rest. I would report, stand the post, and see what the job actually was when I got there. The third daughter's suite sat at the eastern end of the residential wing, past the long gallery of dynastic portraits and around a corner that held a permanent draft. The kind that suggests the building's ventilation system drew its plans without fully including that stretch of corridor. From the integration quarters in the administrative block, it was a substantial walk, and I made it at the pace I used for all timed arrivals, steady enough to get there with a few minutes to spare, slow enough not to arrive winded. The anteroom was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I'd been expecting exactly. I had done a courtesy inspection rotation in the First Prince's anteroom months earlier, large enough to seat a small delegation, with inlaid mosaic on the floor and standing lamp fixtures and a ceiling that had been designed with ceremonial occasions in mind. The third daughter's anteroom was none of that. It was a room for waiting in, and only that. 2 stone benches against the far wall, a single narrow window set high, admitting daylight in a column about the width of my hand, a closed door to the inner suite. The floor was pale undressed stone. There was a single wall sconce and nothing else. There was no senior keeper. I stood at the entrance for 3 minutes, counting my breath the way I'd learned to count it during the 22-day standoff on the Vithas relay station, where patience had been the primary requirement, and not losing the thread of it had been the secondary one. Then I moved to the right of the door frame, back to the wall, facing the corridor. Standard post geometry, feet set, hands loose, eyes on the passage. I waited. The senior keeper arrived at 9 minutes past. She was Cerealian, first-tier household caste, formal braid, embroidered collar, the posture of someone interrupted mid-task and not pleased about it. She looked at me, then at the position I'd taken, then at me again. The integration office sent you, she said. Sergeant Rail Vane, I said. Integration Corps, Ceremonial Guard. Dawn Right Detail. She was holding a slim ledger against her arm, and she looked at it now instead of at me, with the expression of someone checking a record they already know and confirming it is both accurate and unsatisfying. "The protocol is as follows," she said. "You remain at the anteroom entrance for the full duration of the rite. You do not enter the inner suite under any circumstances. You do not initiate contact with any member of the household staff. You do not look directly at the inner suite doorway when the third daughter is present." "Understood," I said. "The ceremony runs approximately 50 minutes. You will not receive refreshment. If you need relief of post, you arrange that before arrival." She looked at me once more, the look of someone assigning a provisional category to something they're not certain about yet. "You will be dismissed at the conclusion of the rite." "Understood," I said again. She gave me one more look, the kind that functions as punctuation at the end of a sentence that didn't need any more words and left. I stood the post. The first 3 mornings were uneventful in the particular way that first mornings at any new post are uneventful. There is a quality to a station you haven't learned yet. Everything presents itself a little too loudly. Every sound from the corridor is a potential event that you assess and categorize before you've quite decided to. Every footfall registers as a possible approach. You calibrate down over time. In those first 3 days, I was still calibrating up. The household staff came and went, 3 of them each morning. Cerulean, lower residential caste by their collar embroidery, carrying folded cloth and shallow vessels I didn't look at directly enough to identify. They spoke to each other in the quick, low register that residential staff use when they need to communicate without letting sound carry into the adjacent room. They glanced at me when they passed and said nothing. I said nothing. The inner suite door opened and closed twice during each ceremony. I tracked it by sound and kept my eyes on the corridor. I counted the faint rhythm of the ventilation draft and waited for the ceremony to end. At somewhere around 48 minutes each morning, the staff began coming back out. The senior keeper appeared a minute or two behind them, checked something in her ledger, and said dismissed. I left. I did that for 3 days. On the 4th, the staff arrived later than usual. I had been at the post for close to 25 minutes when they came through the corridor, and the tallest of the 3 with a senior braid that marked her above the others by at least 1 grade slowed when she passed me. Not a full stop. More of a deceleration with intention behind it. "You're still here," she said. "I'm on post," I said. She held there a moment, not quite going anywhere, doing whatever private calculation she was doing. Then she continued inside. 15 minutes into the ceremony, she came back out alone and stood in the anteroom the way people stand when they've come to say something and are still deciding how to begin. "The previous guards left," she said. "Some before the integration office transferred them, some after. The posting doesn't usually keep people." I thought about saying something and decided there was nothing useful to say. The things that came to mind were either questions I shouldn't ask or observations that wouldn't improve anything. "You don't find this one difficult," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I find it a posting," I said. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that operated on registers I didn't have quite enough context to read yet. Then she went back inside. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned what I had not been told when I took the assignment. I learned it the way you learn most things in residential service sideways, through the ambient conversations of people who had stopped registering me as someone who might be paying attention. The Integration Corps guards in the Citadel occupied an undefined position. We weren't furniture. Furniture gets ignored without effort, but we occupied a similar functional category. Ignoring us required a mild and consistent conscious decision not to look, not to address, not to include. The household staff had been making that decision for long enough that it had become automatic, which meant that after a week or so of standing in the corridor, I began to hear things said in my presence that probably would not have been said to me directly. Mira Sorel was the 3rd daughter of the sovereign ruling house. This was a fact. What it meant operationally in the architecture of the Citadel was a different matter. The 1st daughter heir, North Tower. The posting every integration officer with ambition spent years trying to organize the residential wing around herself by simple gravity. The 2nd daughter had been bonded into a diplomatic alliance at 21 and now managed a secondary court in the Southern Passage with her own staff and a formal rotation and a schedule that kept her anteroom in constant motion. Mira occupied the Eastern Suite. Her bonding candidacy had been presented formally to the Belthori Noble Alliance and declined. Then presented to the Kethas diplomatic circuit and declined again. She now lived in the Eastern Wing with 4 attendants and a senior keeper and a ceremonial guard posting that, as the tall attendant had told me, did not usually keep people. The reason it didn't keep people was not, I understood now, accidental. The Cerulean Citadel did not operate through anything so direct as malice. It operated through the logic of protocol, and protocol could produce outcomes that resembled deliberate harm without any single person intending them, the way a river doesn't mean to damage the banks it wears down. The Dawn Right guard slot had been assigned to the third daughter's suite because the third daughter's suite had an unfilled slot, and the residency directive required a core presence, and the administration had placed the core presence where the gap was least significant. The least significant gap was the third daughter's, because the third daughter was, in the Citadel's internal accounting, the member of the sovereign household to whom the fewest resources needed to be directed. The senior keeper had chosen the assignment grade and the protocol restrictions with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was communicating without needing to state it. Previous core guards had understood it too, and had found it demoralizing 50 minutes outside a closed door every morning. No acknowledgement from anyone, dismissed without ceremony, and had requested transfers, some of them within the first week. I had stood worse posts than the Eastern Anteroom. I had stood an assignment at a decommissioned relay station on the Vethus border corridor for 11 days, in a room with 2 working light panels out of 4, and a recycling unit that made a sound the maintenance division classified as within tolerance, and which I would not have classified that way. I had stood a perimeter post through a 3-week political standoff in the Northern Transit Corridor that resolved without incident the way most standoffs do, which is why the people who stand them tend to feel, afterward, that they spent 3 weeks doing nothing. I had covered a supply inspection at the outer edge of the Keithus hub in weather the transit authority called seasonally variable, and which I called the reason I started carrying a second pair of socks in my kit everywhere I went, against any of that. The Eastern Anteroom with its stone benches and its narrow morning window and its honest, uncomplicated quiet was almost good. I stood the post every morning at the same time, in the same position, with the same attention I brought to every post I had ever been given. Toward the end of the 3rd week, the tall attendant whose name I had gathered was Dea, a short form of something longer she hadn't offered and I hadn't asked for. Because Corps personnel don't ask residential staff for their full names, stopped treating me as part of the ambient environment. It happened gradually, without announcement, the way adjustments in residential service always happen. First, she started giving me the brief downward tilt of the head that Cerulean staff gave each other when their duties brought them to the same space, and they needed to register each other's presence without interrupting the flow of work. That nod was a significant upgrade from 3 weeks of nothing. I noted it without showing I had noted it. Then she began stopping occasionally, when the anteroom was empty and the ceremony was running and the corridor was quiet, and saying things, careful things. She had 6 years in the third daughter's suite and understood its protocols better than anyone, which meant she also understood the limits of what she could say to a Corps officer without putting herself somewhere she didn't want to be. But she would say things like, "The second daughter's rotation processes its credentials through the principal steward's office, not the integration desk," said without editorializing, just information, delivered and then left alone. Or, "The senior keeper's daily report routes through the tertiary administrative branch, not the primary one," which told me something about the hierarchy without stating it in so many words. What she was doing, I understood, was drawing the map of the exit for me. She was being kind in the way that people are kind to someone they expect to be leaving, soon offering the context that makes it easier to go, providing the understanding that allows a request for transfer to feel like a reasonable decision rather than a failure. She was orienting me toward departure without saying so outright. Because she was too experienced to say things outright when she didn't have to. I appreciated it. I didn't use it. I stood the post. I came back the next morning and stood it again. By the end of the 4th week, Dea had stopped pointing toward the door and started, cautiously and without fanfare, telling me things about the suite itself instead. What Dea told me about the suite, she told me in pieces, never in a single sitting. Never in a way that could be easily summarized or repeated back to someone who might ask what the integration guard and the senior attendant had been discussing in the corridor during the ceremony. She understood the value of that particular kind of discretion, and I found that I respected it not because I needed to be handled carefully, but because it told me something about the quality of her attention. 6 years in a suite attached to a person the Citadel treated as a secondary concern required either resignation or precision. And Dea had clearly chosen the latter. The ceremony timing, she mentioned once. varied by roughly 4 to 7 minutes, depending on where the Sorelian calendar sat within its seasonal cycle. The formal right calendar ran on a separate count from the administrative one, and the two didn't always align cleanly. During what the household called the short season, the calendar's late phase, roughly analogous to deep winter in the transit hub timekeeping I was used to the ceremony, ran closer to 40 minutes. During the long phase, late spring through midsummer, it sometimes stretched to nearly an hour. Neither variation would be communicated to me in advance unless I knew to expect it, which I now did. She told me this on a morning when the corridor was empty and the ceremony had been running for 35 minutes and she was waiting for it to finish so she could bring the post-right cloth through. She said it the way she said most things, not as instruction, not as briefing, just as information that happened to be available and happened to be the kind of information I would find useful. She was organizing the folded cloth in her arms while she said it, and she didn't look at me while she said it, which I understood to be intentional. It was easier to share information with the corridor than with the corps officer standing in it. I learned the supply routing from the same approach. The morning deliveries were handled through the residential compound's northern access, not the integration block service entrance, which meant they arrived at a different time than I had assumed they would, and through a different corridor, which explained the occasional traffic I'd been hearing before 800 without being able to account for it. The deliveries on the last day of the administrative week were consistently late, something to do with the handover between the outer compound's supply officers and the inner compound's domestic staff, a gap in the scheduling that had apparently existed for some time and been logged for some time and been addressed not at all in that same time. Dea had noted it in the requisition record many times. She mentioned this without apparent frustration, which I thought was either practiced patience or a long time having come to terms with the fact that some gaps don't close because no one sufficiently motivated to close them is positioned to do so. Probably both. The fourth attendant's name was Sola. I didn't learn this from Dea directly. I assembled it from the way the other attendants addressed her, the way the senior keeper addressed her in passing, the way her name sat differently in context than the others. Shorter, not a ranked form of something longer. Sola was the most junior of the four. She had a quality of quiet that was different from the household's general quietness, in that it seemed to be something she had decided on, rather than something she had absorbed from the environment. She moved through the anteroom with the deliberate economy of someone who had thought about how to occupy a space without drawing notice to the fact of occupying it. The first time she looked at me directly, I was 6 days into the posting. She came through the anteroom carrying a tray, paused, and assessed me with the kind of focused attention that had nothing tentative in it. 3 full seconds, which in a residential corridor is a long time. Then she gave me the nod, not the cautious registering presence nod that Dea had eventually given me, but the clean version, the one that says I've completed my assessment and you have been accounted for and continued to the inner suite. I decided I liked her. I kept that opinion to myself, which is where most opinions belong during a new posting. The senior keeper gave me the morning briefing for the first time at the end of the 5th week. In the context of residential service, this was not a small thing. The morning briefing was a standard household function, the day's schedule, any changes to the ceremony timing, any expected personnel in the wing that would affect the anteroom's traffic. Staff received it. Contractors did not. Integration Corps guards on temporary rotation were somewhere in between those categories in the Citadel's hierarchy, which meant they received it when someone decided the operational benefit of including them outweighed the protocol ambiguity of doing so, and not before. The senior keeper did not explain why she had decided this. She appeared at 848, delivered the briefing in a tone that conveyed the information and nothing else, and left before I could say anything in response. The briefing was accurate, complete, and approximately 45 seconds long. I registered it, adjusted my internal schedule for the morning accordingly, and stood the post. The following morning she did it again, and the morning after that. After the 3rd time, I understood that this was the new arrangement and stopped waiting to see whether it would continue. What the morning briefing gave me, practically, was the ability to know when the ceremony would run long before it ran long. I no longer spent the additional minutes calibrating up, wondering whether the extra time meant something had gone wrong inside. I knew the long mornings from the short ones before they started, and I could hold the extended post with the same settled attention I gave the standard one, rather than burning part of that attention on uncertainty. It was, as adjustments go, a minor one. It made a genuine difference. Dea noticed that I had started receiving the briefing. She didn't comment on it directly. She just began, in the days afterward, offering information that assumed I already had the day's schedule rather than information that tried to quietly fill in its gaps. It was a recalibration. She had adjusted her model of how much I knew and updated her approach accordingly. I found this, for reasons I didn't examine too closely, satisfying in a way that went a bit beyond the practical. By the end of the 6th week, I had the ceremony's timing worked out in my head well enough that I could predict, on any given morning, within about 5 minutes when the staff would start coming out. The attendants rotated their duties on a 3-day cycle that was never posted anywhere but was perfectly consistent. Dea took the post-write cloth on the 1st and 4th days. The second attendant, Hessa, handled the secondary vessels on the 2nd and 5th. The third, a quiet woman named Aura, whose collar braids suggested she outranked Hessa by a grade or so, managed the ceremonial lighting on the 3rd day and covered whatever else needed covering on the 6th. Sola moved between them all with a flexibility that suggested she was either the most junior and therefore most versatile, or the most trusted, or possibly both. The senior keeper's mid-morning departure for her administrative review occurred at the same time every single day. This created a window of approximately 12 to 15 minutes during which the anteroom was managed by Dea and Sola alone. Nothing unusual occurred during this window, but knowing it existed mattered in the way that knowing all the rhythms of a space eventually matters it fills in the picture, and a full picture is easier to attend to accurately than a partial one. I stood the post. I learned the suite. I absorbed what was offered without asking for more than was offered, because that was how I had always operated in a new posting. And it was, as far as I could tell, working. By the middle of the 7th week, all 4 attendants were giving me the full professional nod when they passed not the minimal registering nod, but the acknowledged colleague nod, the one that meant something in the grade system I was working within. The corridor had recalibrated itself around the fact of my continued presence, the way spaces do when something occupies them long enough and with enough consistency that the space absorbs it. I had not yet spoken to Mira Sorel. She moved through the anteroom twice each morning, once entering the inner suite at the start of the rite, once exiting at the conclusion, and on neither occasion had she acknowledged my presence in any form. The senior keeper had been explicit. I did not speak unless spoken to. I did not look at the inner suite entrance when the 3rd daughter was present. I was a protocol requirement fulfilling its function. Protocol requirements are not addressed. This was fine. I understood it, and I had no quarrel with it. I was not there to be addressed. I was there to stand the post. The ceremony ran long on the 28th morning. It had run long before 6 or 7 minutes over the standard time, which was within the range Dea had described as normal variation. This was different. At 50 minutes, the staff had not emerged. At 55, they had not emerged. The corridor was empty in the particular mid-morning way that the Citadel's residential wing sometimes settled into. Not silent exactly, but interior, the building turned toward its own functions. The ambient sound dropped to the level of structure and ventilation rather than movement and voice. I stood the post. At 60 minutes, I was still standing it. At 63 minutes, the inner suite door opened. The staff had not come out ahead of it. The senior keeper had not appeared. What I registered in the first half-second. In the peripheral field, I was keeping on the doorway without looking at it directly because the instruction had been clear, and I followed instructions that had been given to me, absent a reason not to. Regardless of how much time had passed since they were given, was not Dea, and not Hessa, and not the senior keeper. It was Mira Sorel. She was wearing the ceremonial robe, deep blue-gray, formal weight, the kind of garment made to be worn for the duration of a specific occasion and then exchanged for something practical as quickly as possible. Her hair was loose. I had seen her hair twice before, moving through the anteroom at the beginning and end of the rite, and on both occasions it had been pinned in the formal upper household style, structured, positioned, reflecting the correct number of household rank markers in the way it was dressed. Loose. It fell past her shoulders and caught the morning column from the narrow window differently than the formal arrangement had. For approximately 1 second I did not register who I was looking at. Then I registered it, and I kept my eyes on the corridor, and I waited. She was taller than the quick movement impressions I'd formed of her in the first 27 mornings. Most Sorelian women in residential service were taller than their counterparts in the administrative wing, which was taller than the core average that I represented. So this was not surprising. What was less expected was the quality of stillness she had standing in the doorway. It was not the stillness of someone who had stopped. It was the stillness of someone who occupied a space deliberately. the way a well-placed piece of furniture occupies a space, not by accident but by design. She was standing in the doorway and looking at the anteroom, and she was doing both of those things on purpose. I held my position, eyes on the corridor wall, back to the stone, standard post geometry. I waited for whatever was about to happen. "You're still here," she said. The sentence was the same one Dea had said to me in the second week. The words were identical. The register was entirely different. Dea had said it with the quality of a person whose expectation had been close to correct and had now been corrected at calibration. The small adjustment you make when the world does something marginally different from what you prepared for. Mira Sorel said it the way you say something you have been checking on for a long time. Not surprised. Confirming. The way you read an instrument after watching it for weeks. Not to discover the reading, but to have it stated clearly once, aloud, where you can hear it. "I'm on post, Highness," I said. A silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone letting a statement occupy the room before they respond to it. "The previous guards didn't stay," she said. "I was told the rotation turned over," I said. I took that to mean the assignment was difficult for them, not that I was expected to leave. Another silence, longer than the first. I kept my gaze on the far wall, tracking her in peripheral the way I tracked any significant presence in a post's field of attention, not looking, but not knowing. The morning light from the narrow window was doing something I had noticed before, but not named yet, at this hour. This angle. It sent a stripe across the pale stone floor that moved over the course of the ceremony. When I arrived in the morning, the stripe was near the window wall. By the time the staff came out, it had crossed most of the room. A slow measurement of time that didn't require a clock. I had been watching it every morning for 4 weeks without deciding to watch it. It had simply become part of what I knew about the room. "Look at me," she said. I turned from the corridor wall and faced her. There is a quality some people have that I have heard described in various ways by various people over 17 years of service. Usually by people trying to explain what made an inspection go differently than they'd planned, or why a conversation with a senior official had felt like something other than a conversation. I had encountered it before in people of sufficient rank and sufficient presence that the two had had time to compound in each other. It was not intimidation. Exactly. It was the quality of being looked at by someone for whom the act of looking was not casual, whose attention, when it arrived with weight. Mira Sorel looked at me the way an engineer looks at a structure they're assessing, not for threat, not with hostility, but with a specific professional interest in what the thing was made of and how. She was measuring something. I held her gaze and let her measure it. "The senior keeper told you not to look at the inner suite entrance," she said. "She did. And you didn't." "No, Highness. But you're here." "I'm here." She looked at me for another moment. Then she looked at the anteroom, at the corridor beyond me, at the narrow stripe of morning across the floor. She looked at it the way I had been looking at it, not studying, just registering. A person taking in the room they're standing in. Then she looked back at me. "Stand guard," she said. "Do not go." There were several things I could have said to that. Most of them were true, but none of them were what the moment required. What the moment required was the simplest version of the relevant truth, stated without embellishment. "I haven't gone in 28 days, I said. She held my gaze for a beat. "I know," she said. "Stand guard anyway." She went back inside. The door closed. The anteroom was empty again, and the corridor was quiet. And the light stripe continued its crossing of the pale stone floor as it had every morning since the first one. Whether or not I had been paying attention to it, I turned back to face the corridor. I set my feet. I put my hands where they belonged. I stood the post. I stood it the following morning and the morning after that. I stood it through the last days of the long phase and into the first days of the short one. When the ceremony timing compressed and the stripe of morning reached the far wall later in the day and the anteroom ran cooler in ways the stone took a while to adjust to, I stood it on the morning the residential wing ran a fire protocols inspection that relocated me briefly to the outer gallery colonnade, where I found a wall to put my back against and a corridor to face and stood that post instead. Because the post is the post and its specific location is a detail and not its substance. The senior keeper stopped saying "dismissed." This happened somewhere in the third week after I'd met Mira at the doorway. I think she had arrived at the conclusion that saying it and having it function as a formality without weight was a kind of administrative fiction, and she was too competent an administrator to maintain fictions that served no purpose. She and I had in common, at minimum, that we did not keep forms that had stopped doing work. Things changed in the way things in residential service change. Not quickly, not with announcement, but by the slow absorption of the surrounding environment, adapting to the fact that something it had expected to be temporary was not temporary. The attendants had given me the colleague's nod. The senior keeper was briefing me in the morning. The suite's rhythms had become familiar enough that I no longer had to think about them the way you don't have to think about a route you have. Walked often enough to walk without thinking, and Mira Sorrell had begun coming to the threshold after the rite concluded. Not every morning. On average 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes she stood there and looked at the corridor and went back inside without saying anything, which I came to understand was its own kind of communication, the communication of someone checking that a thing is still in place. Sometimes she asked questions. The questions were not small talk. She was not, I gathered, someone who made small talk, or if she had once been. The particular circumstances of her situation in the Citadel had removed whatever inclination she'd had toward it. The first question she asked was how long I had been in the Corps. 17 years, I said, and before this posting, transit hub integration. Primarily, 3 years on the Vethis rotation before the transfer here. Before that, the border corridor. A relay station assignment that ran 11 days longer than scheduled. Standard Corps rotation before that, perimeter watch. Border detail. 2 years on the supply chain inspection circuit in the outer territories. She was quiet for a moment, working through the sequence. 17 years, she said, and they posted you here. The integration desk posted me where the slot was open, I said. The slot was open because the previous guards found it undesirable. I was told the rotation turned over, I said. That I took to mean the assignment had been difficult for them, and you understood what that meant. I understood what it meant, I said. And you took the posting anyway. I take the posting in front of me. I've been doing that for 17 years. Some of them have been more demanding than others. This one is not the hardest I've stood. She looked at me without responding immediately. The morning light had crossed the floor and reached the far wall. It stayed there for a while in the late morning before the angle shifted and it started to retreat. I had been watching it long enough to know the retreat was coming. What is the hardest one you've stood? She asked. I thought about the relay station on the Vethis border. 11 days in a room with no exterior light and 2 functional panels out of 4, and a recycling unit that made a sound the maintenance division called within tolerance, and which I had spent 11 days calling something else in my head. I thought about the second week of the northern standoff, when the weather in the corridor had been cold enough that I'd stopped being able to feel the difference between my feet and the floor beneath them, and had to stand the post concentrating very hard on keeping my weight distributed correctly. There's been a few, I said. This anteroom is not on the list. She was quiet again. Then she went inside. The conversations at the threshold did not follow a pattern I could predict. That was the first thing I noticed about them. Most things in the Eastern Suite had patterns: the ceremony timing, the staff rotation, the senior keeper's administrative schedule, the morning delivery that was always late at the week's end. The suite ran on its patterns the way all residential operations run on theirs. Because patterns are what allows a household to function without constant renegotiation of every small thing. And a household that renegotiates every small thing burns most of its energy on the renegotiation. But Mira came to the threshold when she came to it, and I could not find the underlying logic of the timing. It was not on the days the ceremony ran short, though it was sometimes on those days. It was not on the days the corridor had traffic, though occasionally it was then too. It was not correlated, as far as I could determine, with the administrative calendar or the seasonal rite schedule or anything else I had a record of. I spent several of the 45-minute ceremony intervals in the 6th, 7th, and 8th weeks of the posting trying to identify the variable I was missing. Eventually, I concluded I was not missing a variable. The timing reflected something interior that had no external marker I could observe from the post, and I stopped looking for one. What I could observe was what she did when she came. She would stand in the doorway in the post-rite robe or, later in the weeks when I had been there long enough that the formality of the doorway had changed slightly in character, in the more practical dress she wore for the afternoon obligations I had pieced together from corridor contexts that she attended. She would look at the anteroom. She would look at the corridor. She would look at me standing in it. And there would be a moment variable in length, never long enough to constitute waiting, short enough that it couldn't be called hesitation, in which she was doing something I had no clean word for. Checking, maybe. Except checking implies you're uncertain about the result, and she never seemed uncertain about it. Confirming something she already knew. Taking a reading. The way you look at an instrument you trust but look at anyway, because the looking is its own form of attention. Sometimes she had a question. Sometimes she stood there and said nothing and went back inside. And the silence was not uncomfortable because it had something in it, a quality of acknowledged presence rather than absence. You can tell the difference between a silence that means nothing is happening and a silence that means something is happening without requiring words. 17 years of post work teaches you to read that particular distinction. I stood the post. I learned, slowly, what the threshold visits were for. The second real conversation, real, meaning something beyond logistics and history, began on a morning when the ceremony had run close to its longest. The light stripe from the narrow window had reached the far wall before the staff came out. Mira appeared in the doorway a few minutes after them, still in the ceremonial robe, and she stood there looking at the corridor the way she sometimes did when she wasn't going to say anything. Then she said something. "The Belthori Alliance declined my bonding candidacy," she said. No preamble, no transition. The way you say something that has been waiting a long time to be said out loud and has finally decided not to wait any longer. 14 months ago. The Kethis diplomatic circuit declined it 8 months ago. I said nothing. Not because I didn't have a response, but because the statement had the quality of something that needed space around it before a response would be useful. "The senior keeper designed this posting," she said. "The protocol slot, the grade of assignment, the instructions she gave you on the first morning." A pause. She understood what she was communicating. "I understand what she was communicating," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You don't seem troubled by it." I thought about how to answer that honestly without being either dismissive or, in the other direction, performing an outrage I didn't actually feel. "The grade the senior keeper assigns the posting doesn't change what the posting is," I said. "It doesn't change what I do here every morning." Which is, it was not a question. It was the way you say something when you already know the answer and you want to hear whether the person across from you knows it too when you need the answer spoken. Not because the information is missing, but because the spoken version is different in kind from the known one. "Stand guard," I said. "Do not go." She looked at me, and then she looked at the corridor, and then she looked at the light stripe across the floor. It had reached the wall and started its slow retreat. I had been watching it long enough to know when the retreat began without having to look directly. She went back inside without saying anything else, but there was something different in the quality of her departure from the ones that had come before it. Not a resolution exactly, more like a door that had opened slightly in a room that had been closed. And, while nothing had come through the door yet, the opening was its own event. I had a conversation with Dea around this time that I have thought about more than once since. It was mid-ceremony, corridor empty, and she had been telling me about the ventilation system in the inner suite's east wall, which occasionally produced a sound that resembled a conversation happening 2 rooms away and was in fact the duct expanding in the morning temperature shift. She had reported it to the maintenance division twice, she said, with identically unsatisfying results. The maintenance division had filed it under building settlement. She expected the third report would be filed the same way. I asked her how long she had served in the third daughter's suite. She gave the question the consideration Sorelian staff give to questions that touch on things they're not certain they should answer. 6 years, she said. Eventually. Before the integration directive, before it. During it, the directive hadn't changed the posting for any of them. It had only added me, and the third daughter, I said. I stopped there, because there wasn't a way to finish that sentence that didn't involve referencing the bonding candidacies, which I was reasonably certain I was not supposed to know about, and which I had learned through the walls of the corridor rather than through anyone's deliberate disclosure. Dea looked at the far wall for a moment with the expression of someone working out how to answer a question honestly while not quite answering it directly. "She is the third daughter," she said, which was both the most accurate thing she could have said and a complete answer to everything I had actually meant to ask. She was the third daughter, not the heir. Not the bonded daughter. Not the one the Citadel had organized itself around or spent its resources on or aimed its attention toward. The third. Occupying the eastern suite with 4 attendants and a senior keeper and a ceremonial guard rotation that didn't stay. I nodded and said nothing else. Dea finished her account of the ventilation duct and went back to her duties. The ceremony concluded at the standard time. I stood the post. The third conversation I think about most happened on a morning when the rite had run short. The light stripe was barely a third of the way across the floor when the staff came out, which put it early, which put Mira at the doorway earlier than usual. She had the look of someone who had arranged what they wanted to say before arriving and was now executing the arrangement, which was different from the previous visits, where the words had seemed to find their form in the speaking. "My sister's guard rotation has 12 officers," she said, "a formal relief schedule, credentials processed through the principal steward's office." "I know," I said. Dea mentioned it. Something shifted in her stillness, a small quality change. The particular adjustment of someone who has received information they were not expecting to receive. Not large. She didn't show things largely. "What else has Dea mentioned?" she said. It was not quite a question. "The Thursday deliveries," I said. "The ventilation duct in the east wall. The tertiary branch routing for the senior keeper's reports." She was quiet for a moment, working through that. "She's been telling you how the suite operates," she said. "She's been telling me the things that would make the post easier to stand," I said, "which is what any experienced staff member does for a new posting, when they expect the new posting to stay." She looked at me with an expression I had not seen before and did not have an immediate category for. It was not the measuring look, which had its own texture. It was not the confirming look, which was something else again. It was the look of someone who has been expecting something not to happen for a very long time, and who does not quite know how to hold it when it begins to happen, because the expectation of its absence has become so settled that its presence doesn't fit easily into the space where the absence used to be. "The previous guards didn't stay long enough for Dea to tell them anything," she said. "I know. She told me that." A pause. "She told you about the previous guards. She told me the rotation turned over. She offered the information in the second week. I think she was trying to help me understand what I had walked into." I considered for a moment. "I think she was also trying to make the exit clear, so that if I chose to use it, it wouldn't be awkward." "And you didn't use it." "I didn't need it," I said. "I wasn't planning to exit." She was quiet for long enough that I heard Sola moving through the inner chamber, her footsteps even and unhurried on the stone floor. The sound carried differently in the morning when the corridor was still. I had learned to track the attendance by sound the way I tracked most things in the suite without deciding to, just by being there long enough that the information accumulated. "Why?" she said. It was a short question that wanted a long answer, and I knew better than to give it the long version. Because the long version would have required explaining things I wasn't sure I had the vocabulary for yet, and which would have come out imprecise. I thought about the relay station on the Vethis border. I thought about the northern standoff. I thought about every posting slip I had ever been handed and how I had picked each one up and done with it what the job required. "Because the post in front of me is the post that matters," I said. "When they send me somewhere, I am there, not half there, not standing it while I think about somewhere else. There, the suite you're posted to is the one that's real. The ones you might have preferred are something else." She looked at the corridor, then at me. Then she said something in Cerulean that I didn't catch, too low, too rapid, and not directed at me. Said to herself, the way people sometimes say things to themselves when they are processing something they hadn't expected to need to process. Then she went inside. I had been at the post long enough by now that Sola had started looking at me with something other than assessment in her expression. I am not sure exactly when this happened. It was gradual, the way all the suite's adjustments had been gradual. But there came a morning when she passed through the anteroom with the post-right cloth and paused. And the look she gave me was not the quick professional evaluation I had grown used to from her, but something quieter. The look of someone who has arrived at a conclusion about a thing and is deciding whether to note it openly. She didn't say anything that morning. She noted the conclusion and continued to the inner suite. 2 mornings later, she set a covered cup on the bench near the door when she came through at 840. The way you set something down in a space that belongs to someone without making a formal presentation of it. The cup held the Cerulean morning beverage, a warm, slightly bitter infusion that the household staff drank in the first hour of the day, which I had smelled for weeks coming through the anteroom and which I had not expected to be offered. I took the cup. I drank it. It was very good in the way that things are good when you have been standing in a cool stone corridor since 855 and the ceremony still has 20 minutes to run. The next morning, Sola set the cup on the bench again without being asked and without saying anything about it. I took it again. This became the arrangement. It was never discussed. There was no formal acknowledgement of it from either side, because that was not how things worked in this suite. And it was. I was beginning to understand, not how Sola operated in general. She had decided I was going to stay, and she had adjusted her behavior around that decision. And the cup on the bench was the concrete form that adjustment had taken. I mentioned it to no one. It was not the kind of thing you mention. But I noted it the way I noted all the suite's adjustments to my presence, as information about where things stood. The conversation that came closest to explaining something I had been trying to understand, since the second week happened on a morning in what the Sorelian calendar called the mid-short phase deep into the cool season. The ceremony running at its compressed timing. The light stripe from the narrow window slower to move than it was in the long phase. Mira came to the threshold after the rite and stood there looking at the corridor and then at the stripe of light. The Belthori envoy told the sovereign household the candidacy was declined on grounds of diplomatic alignment, she said. The formal language was very precise. I said nothing. The Kethesirk sent a letter, she said. The letter was also very precise. Both letters were very precise about what they were not saying. What were they not saying? I said. That a third daughter with 2 declined candidacies is not an asset in an alliance. She is a question that the alliance would spend resources on answering, and the resources are not worth the question. A pause. The senior keeper understood this. The posting was her response to it. A communication to the integration office about the appropriate grade of assignment for this suite. And the integration office sent me, I said. The integration office sent whoever was available, she said. They weren't making a statement. The posting slot had to be filled, and it was filled with whoever was available. That's correct, I said. You knew that. I knew the slot was open and I was available, I said. I didn't know the rest of it until later. She looked at me. Does the rest of it matter? Now that you know it. I thought about this honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. The senior keeper's opinion of the appropriate grade of assignment for this suite is her opinion. I said, it has no operational effect on what I do here. It doesn't change the post. No, she said. And there was something in her voice that I wasn't sure I had heard before, not agreement. Exactly, but the quality of a person touching a thing they had thought was in one place and finding it still there. It doesn't change the post. She stayed at the threshold for another moment. The light stripe moved by the incremental amount it always moved in that time, which was less than it looked like and more than you'd think. 17 years, she said, not as a question, just the number, set down in the space between us. 17 years, I said. She went inside. The ceremony had concluded and the suite was settling into its mid-morning quiet, and I turned back to face the corridor and stood the post the same way I had stood it every morning since the first one, with the same attention, in the same position, with the same understanding that the quality of the standing was what I had to offer and that I would offer it for as long as the post was mine to stand. That was how the 8th week ended. The 9th was much the same. The 10th was the week the formal assignment request arrived. The request came on a Thursday, which I remember because the morning delivery had been late again, and Dea had made her notation in the requisition log with the expression of someone performing an act they have performed many times and expect to perform many times more, without any particular expectation that the performance will eventually produce a different result. She noted it. She closed the log. She moved on to the next thing. Because that was what you did when you worked in a household where some things did not change, regardless of how many times they were documented. I had been at the post for 40 minutes when Barrack appeared in the corridor. This was unusual. Warrant clerks from the integration desk did not generally come to the residential wing. They processed assignments from the administrative block and sent communication through the standard routing channels. And the standard routing channels did not involve walking across the compound to the eastern corridor on a Thursday morning. Barrack walked like a man on an errand he had not been given sufficient context for, which I recognized because I had walked the same way on a number of occasions in my first years in the Corps. Before I stopped requiring context to walk somewhere I had been told to walk, he handed me a form without preamble. It was a standard integration assignment card. The same format as the one he had handed me across his desk 10 weeks earlier on the Wednesday morning that smelled like solvent. Same layout, same print weight, same 3-line structure, except this one was not 3 lines. This one had 5, and the 5th line carried a seal I had not seen on an integration form before. Permanent residential assignment. The card read, Third Daughter's Suite, Eastern Wing, Sovereign Household, Requesting Officer, Mira Sorel, third daughter of the Sovereign House. The seal at the bottom was personal, not administrative, the small compressed mark of an individual rather than an office. I read it twice, then I looked at Barrack. He had the expression of a man who had recalibrated something on the walk across the compound and had not yet finished processing what the recalibration meant. Permanent residential assignments go through the principal steward's office. he said, not the integration desk. The integration desk handles temporary postings and rotation transfers. I know, I said. This came through the integration desk, he said, with the third daughter's personal seal, which is not a standard integration form feature. No, I said, it isn't. A pause. He looked at the form, then at me, then at the corridor, then back at the form. The integration office processes what the sovereign household asks the integration office to process, he said, which was the most direct statement I had heard from him in 10 weeks. He said it with the air of a man who has arrived at this conclusion through some effort and is not entirely at peace with it, but has decided to proceed on its basis regardless. Will you accept? I looked at the card again. I thought about the anteroom, the stone benches, the narrow window, the light stripe moving across the floor. I thought about Dea telling me the Thursday delivery was late again and making her notation with the patient. Slightly resigned expression of someone maintaining a record for its own sake. I thought about Sola setting the cup on the bench without being asked and without making anything of it. I thought about the ventilation duct in the east wall that sounded like a conversation 2 rooms away and wasn't. I thought about 45 minutes every morning in a space I now knew well enough to have stopped thinking about knowing it, which is the point at which knowing becomes something else. I thought about a sentence spoken at a doorway on the 28th morning. Stand guard. Do not go. I had been thinking about that sentence with some regularity for 8 weeks, not because I didn't understand it, but because the understanding had weight to it. And weight is the kind of thing you keep returning to make sure you are holding correctly. Yes, I said. Barrick took the form back, made a notation on his copy, and left the way he had come. I turned back to the corridor and put my hands where they belonged and stood the post for the remaining 20 minutes of the ceremony. And then stood it for the 3 minutes after that while the staff came out, and then stood it until the senior keeper appeared and gave me the morning briefing for the following day with her usual clipped precision. She did not mention the form. She did not mention permanent assignments or personal seals or warrant clerks appearing in the eastern corridor on Thursday mornings. She mentioned that the ceremony on the following day would run at the short phase timing and that a supply review was scheduled in the outer wing that would affect corridor traffic between 1,100 and 1,300. Then she left. I left shortly after, at my usual pace, on my usual route, through the residential wing and around the corner with the draft, and past the dynastic portrait gallery and back to the integration quarters. I had paperwork to complete and a set of administrative acknowledgments to process that Barrick had told me would take most of the following morning. I did not think about the form during the walk back. There was nothing further to think about. The thinking had been done in the anteroom in the 45 seconds between Barrick handing me the card and me saying yes, and whatever had needed to be weighed had been weighed then. The administrative processing took 3 days rather than 1. Because the principal steward's office had not received advance notice of the routing change and needed time to update its records, and the integration desk had not previously processed a permanent residential assignment and needed to confirm its authority to do so with the secondary administrative branch. And the secondary administrative branch needed 2 days to confirm. This was, as far as I could tell, a normal outcome for any process that moved between jurisdictions that had not moved between them before. I spent the 3 days on a temporary rotation covering the outer corridor watch while my credentials were updated, which was not unpleasant. The outer corridor was cold at that time of year and the watch was uneventful, and I stood it with the same attention I gave everything and didn't think about the paperwork while I was standing it. On the 4th day, the processing was complete and a modification had been made to my uniform. A narrow border at the sleeve cuff in the cerulean residential administrative thread color, the specific embroidery that indicated permanent assignment to the sovereign household's residential wing. It was a small addition. Against the rest of the uniform, it was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. The people who needed to know what they were looking at would know. I reported to the eastern anteroom on the following Monday at 848, which was 12 minutes before the ceremony start and 8 minutes before my previous standard arrival. The adjustment felt appropriate without my having made a deliberate decision about it. Permanent postings have different rhythms than temporary ones. The time that the temporary guard spends establishing that they are going to show up is the time the permanent guard can spend on something more useful. Dea was in the anteroom when I arrived. She was checking the morning supply delivery, which had arrived early. For once a fact, she was logging in the requisition record with an expression that suggested she didn't trust it yet. She looked up when I came in. She looked at the sleeve cuff. She looked at the embroidery border. She looked at my face. Then she looked back at the embroidery. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," I said. She was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that belongs to someone who has recalibrated an expectation and is deciding whether to say so out loud. Most of the time, Dea decided not to say things out loud. She had a preference for information delivered indirectly, through implication and context. The way she had spent the first weeks of the posting telling me about exits rather than telling me to use them. This time, she did not do that. "She hasn't had a permanent guard," she said, "since she moved to this suite." She paused. "That is 6 years. I absorbed this." "I know," I said. She looked at me once more, with the measuring, recalibrating expression that I had come to recognize as her version of acknowledgement, the look that meant she had updated her record and the update had taken. Then she went back to the supply log. "The senior keeper is going to have opinions about the cuff embroidery," she said, not looking up. "The senior keeper can file them with the principal steward's office," I said. Dea made a short, controlled sound that I decided to count as a laugh. It was the most Dea had reacted to anything I had said in 10 weeks, which told me something about how much had shifted, and how quickly it had shifted once it started. I moved to the right of the doorframe and set my feet and faced the corridor and waited for the ceremony to begin. Mira Sorel came through the anteroom at 856, moving toward the inner suite in the quiet, efficient way she moved in the mornings when the day's obligations were already arranged in her mind and she was working through the practical preliminaries. She passed the post without stopping, 2 feet from the inner suite door. She paused. She did not turn around. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said. "Good morning, Highness," I said. She went inside. The door closed. The anteroom settled back into its mid-ceremony quiet, and the light came in through the narrow window and began its crossing of the floor. And I stood the post. The senior keeper noticed the embroidery at the start of the morning briefing. She was 3 sentences into the schedule when she stopped, looked at my cuff, continued looking at it for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the previous moments she had given to things she did not immediately know what to do with, and then continued the briefing without saying anything about it. The briefing was complete, accurate, and delivered with the same clipped professionalism as every previous briefing. After she left, I noted that the briefing had been 3 sentences longer than usual, including details about the week's visitor schedule that she had not previously included. I noted this and said nothing about it and adjusted my internal picture of the week accordingly. She did not, in the days that followed, say anything directly to me about the embroidery or the permanent assignment or the departure from standard processing that had resulted in both. What she did was continue to give me the morning briefing. What she also did, over the following weeks, was give me slightly more of it each time, until the briefing I received was functionally complete, the same briefing the household staff received, with the same level of operational detail, no more and no less. I respected this. I respected it the way I respected anyone who performs a duty they have accepted without enthusiasm but with full competence. There are worse ways to operate. There are worse things to have in common with someone. Dea told me about the 6 years on a morning 2 months after the permanent assignment, when the ceremony was running in the short phase timing and the corridor was empty and there was enough quiet that the ventilation duct in the east wall had started its morning expansion, producing the distant conversation sound that the maintenance division had not fixed and was not going to fix. She had not told me before the permanent assignment. She told me now. "Before you," she said. "The integration desk sent this suite whatever was least wanted elsewhere." She said it without inflection, the way she said most things that carried more than their words. Not the worst guards. Not people who couldn't do the work. People whose postings the desk had no better use for. People who could be spared from assignments that mattered. I said nothing. "They understood what the posting was," she said. "Most of them understood it before the end of the first week. Some of them understood it from the card." She was looking at the supply log, not at me. "They requested transfers. The desk processed the transfers. The suite had an opening again. The desk filled it again. This is how it went for 6 years. I thought about the Wednesday morning in the administrative block. The solvent smell. Barrick's flat expression handing me the card without looking up. Third daughter's residential suite. Dawn Wright ceremonial guard. Report 900. If they had told me all of that when they gave me the card, I said, I don't know that I would have taken it the same way. Dea looked up from the log. "No. Maybe," I said. "Maybe not. I like to think I would have." But 17 years of standing posts makes you believe things about yourself that may or may not survive having all the information. I thought about this honestly. I had the card, and the card said what it said, and I went where it sent me. That's what I've been doing for 17 years. I didn't know there was a reason to do it differently. She was quiet for a moment. The guards who left, she said, knew why they were leaving. They understood the message the posting was sending, and they acted on it. I didn't get the message. I said, I got a posting card. Another quiet. And now you know, she said, what the card was actually saying. Now I know, I said. It doesn't change anything. She looked at me the way she had looked at me. On the morning, I came back with the embroidery on my cuff, with the update and recalibrate expression. Then she went back to the supply log. The Thursday delivery is going to be late again, she said. I can tell from the outer compound's requisition count. It's going to be late, and I'm going to note it, and it is going to happen again the following Thursday. I know, I said. I'm noting it anyway. I know that too, I said. She made the notation. The ceremony continued. The distant conversation sound from the ventilation duct ran through its morning sequence and faded. I stood the post. There is a thing that happens when you stand a post long enough and with enough consistent attention. The post becomes yours in a way that is different from the formal assignment of it. The formal assignment is a card and a cuff embroidery and a record in the integration desk's ledger. The other thing is harder to name. It is something like the difference between a chair that you sit in and a chair that is yours not because you own it, but because you have sat in it long enough that the shape of the sitting has become mutual. The chair knows where you sit and you know what the chair does in response, and that knowing is bilateral and cannot be transferred by paperwork alone. I had stood the eastern anteroom for long enough that the post was mine in that second sense. I knew the width of the light stripe at 900 in each phase of the Cerealian calendar. I knew the ventilation duct's morning sequence and when the distant conversation sound would start and when it would stop. I knew which of Sola's footstep patterns meant she was carrying something and which meant she wasn't. I knew the 12-minute window when Dea and Sola managed the anteroom alone and what the corridor's traffic looked like in each section of the administrative week. I knew all of this the way I knew the relay station's recycler sound and the northern corridor's wind and the outer hub's weather patterns, not because I had tried to know it, but because I had been there, attending to the post in front of me, for long enough that the knowing accumulated on its own. The post is the post. What you bring to it is what you have, and what you have, after 17 years, is the capacity to be fully where you are rather than half somewhere else. That, as far as I could tell, was the only thing I had done differently from the 6 guards who had come before me. I had not known what the posting was saying. I had not received the message it was designed to send. I had received a card, and I had brought myself to what the card described, completely and without reservation. The same way I had brought myself to every post I had ever been given, and I had stayed. The suite had adjusted. The corridor had adjusted. The senior keeper had adjusted, in her precise and fully professional way. Dea had adjusted. Sola had adjusted. With the morning cup on the bench that she still set out every day without being asked and without making anything of it. The same way the embroidery on my cuff was not made much of by anyone, but meant something to all of them. And they all knew it meant something. And that knowing had changed the operational texture of the suite in ways that were impossible to specify exactly, but were completely unmistakable if you had been present for the before. Mira Sorel came to the threshold 2 or 3 mornings a week now. Sometimes she stood and looked at the corridor. Sometimes she asked a question. Sometimes she said nothing and stood for a moment and went back inside. And the standing was the thing, not the question and not the silence. I understood, as well as I could understand something, through observation rather than through being told. That the corridor was the only place in the Citadel where someone stood watch specifically for her, not for the protocol, not for the unfilled integration slot, not for the suite or the household or the directive that had required a core presence at all residential rights. For her and for no other reason. I was in the corridor. That was where I was, and where I had chosen to stay, and where the card had sent me on the Wednesday morning with the solvent smell, and where I intended to remain. The post was the post. I stood it. I am writing this from the anteroom bench, which is where I write anything that needs writing. The bench is the only flat surface in the anteroom that isn't the floor, and the floor would require sitting on it, which is a thing I am still capable of but which I find I prefer not to do when there is an alternative. The bench is against the far wall, beneath the narrow window. And in the mornings during the ceremony, it receives the first of the light and holds it the longest. And the light at this hour, in this phase of the Circadian calendar, is the thin, clean kind that comes with cool weather and has no weight to it. It sits on the stone without warming it. I have been watching it for 11 months, and I know what it does at every hour of the morning in every phase of the calendar, which is the kind of knowledge that accumulates without your trying to accumulate it, given sufficient time and a fixed position from which to observe. 11 months is not a long time in most reckonings. It is longer than I have spent at any residential posting and shorter than a dozen transit hub rotations I have stood in my 17 years. And against the full span of the course service, it is not a significant interval. But 11 months in a single anteroom, standing the same post at the same time in the same position every morning, is long enough that the post has become something other than an assignment. I am not sure there is a precise word for what it becomes after that point. It becomes the place you are, rather than a place you have been sent. Sola brought the morning cup at 8:42 today, 4 minutes earlier than usual. She set it on the bench and looked at me, and I looked at it, and she left without either of us saying anything, which is how it goes every morning. I have been drinking the Cerulean morning infusion for 2 months, and I find that I have come to depend on it in the specific way you come to depend on things you didn't know you wanted until they arrived, and then can't quite remember the texture of the mornings before them. It is warm and slightly bitter, and it tastes like the short season in the Eastern anteroom, which is to say that it tastes, now, like something that is mine. The Cerulean morning infusion is not something I would have known to order for myself. I would not have known where to order it from, and I would not have thought to ask. Sola knew this. She set the cup down without asking whether I wanted it. The way you do something for someone when you have decided to do it and don't need their participation in the decision. 2 months ago, this was a new thing, and I noticed it as a new thing. Now it is part of the morning, and I notice it the way I notice all the things that are part of the morning, which is to say I notice it by its absence when it doesn't happen, not by its presence when it does. This is, I understand, what belonging to a place looks like from the inside. The senior keeper gave me the morning briefing at 8:36, with the same efficient precision she has brought to every morning briefing since she started including me in them. The briefing was 5 sentences. The ceremony would run at standard short-phase timing. The Outer Wings administrative staff had a formal review scheduled that would bring additional corridor traffic through the Eastern Passage between 1,000 and 1,100. The principal steward's office would be sending a credential update form for my permanent assignment file that I should return by the end of the week. The next week's rite calendar had one modification on the 4th day, which would shift the ceremony start 15 minutes later than usual. She delivered all of this without looking at me longer than the delivery required, which is how she has delivered it every morning, which is the senior keeper at her most senior keeper performing the full substance of a duty she has accepted without ever softening the form of the performance into something warmer than duty. I have stopped expecting something warmer than duty from her, and I have stopped wanting it. Duty is what the arrangement requires. Duty is what I provide and what she provides, and the arrangement has operated correctly on that basis for 2 months, and I expect it will continue to do so. After she left, Dea appeared from the corridor with the morning supply check and began her count of the delivery, which had arrived on time today, which was a Thursday, which was the day it did not arrive on time, without exception. Throughout the entire 10 weeks of the temporary posting and through the 2 months of the permanent one since. Early, I said. She looked up. She looked at the delivery crates. She looked at me. It will be late next Thursday, she said, to compensate. She went back to her count. This is also how things go. There is something Dea told me that I have been turning over for the better part of these 2 months. The way you turn something over when you are not trying to reach a conclusion about it, but are simply keeping it available for examination, not ready yet to put it down. She told me, 2 weeks after the permanent assignment, that she had understood from the 2nd week of my posting that I was different from the guards who had come before me. Not different in any large or remarkable way. Different in the specific and narrow way that matters in residential service, which is that I had not yet understood what the posting was, and the guards who left had understood it. And the understanding had been the thing that sent them out the door. They were not bad guards, she said. Most of them were competent. One of them was one of the better officers I had seen come through the integration detail. He understood the suite within the 1st week. He understood the posting slot, the grade of assignment, what the senior keeper had communicated through the choice of it, what it said about how the Citadel regarded this suite and the person in it. He requested transfer at the end of that first week. He was very polite about it. I thought about that. He understood it and left. I said he was not wrong to leave. She said he had his own career to consider. The posting was designed to send a message, and the message was that this suite did not matter. And if you stayed in a suite that did not matter, you confirmed the message. She looked at the requisition log, not at me. That is a reasonable calculation. Most reasonable people made it. I didn't know I was making a calculation. I said, I know. She said, that was evident in the first week. You stood the post the same way you would have stood it if it had been the first daughter's suite with 12 officers and formal relief rotations. There was no difference in the attention you brought to it. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. I thought about this for a while before I answered. If the integration desk had told me all of it when they handed me the card, I said, I don't know what I would have done. I'd like to think I would have taken it the same way, but liking to think that and knowing it are different things. I had the card. The card said what it said. That's what I was working from. Dea was quiet for a moment. The card said what it said. She repeated, not echoing. Exactly. More like examining the sentence to see what it was made of. Third daughter's residential suite. I said, Dawn Wright Ceremonial Guard. Report 900. I paused. That's a post. I stand posts. I didn't know there was a subtext to it until I had been standing it long enough that the subtext had already become irrelevant. She looked at me then, for a longer moment than she usually gave to things she was deciding about. The previous guard who requested a transfer at the end of his first week, she said, was offered the second daughter's rotation shortly after. He is still there. His career has progressed. Good, I said, and I meant it, without irony, which surprised me slightly. I did not begrudge him the second daughter's rotation or the career that had progressed. He had made the reasonable calculation, and it had produced reasonable results. I had not made a calculation, and it had produced something else, and I could not say with certainty that the thing I had produced was objectively better, only that it was mine, and that I had not set out to produce it, and that it had happened anyway because I had stood the post I was given the way I stand every post I am given, which is completely. You don't mind, Dea said, that you could have been somewhere else. I don't mind. I said, this is where I am. She went back to the requisition log. The ceremony continued its 50 minutes. The light moved across the floor the way it always moved across the floor, and I stood the post. Mira comes to the threshold on average 2 or 3 mornings a week. Sometimes she comes every morning for a stretch of 4 or 5 days and then not for 2 days, and then twice in a day if the rite runs in 2 phases, which it does in the transition between the short and long seasons when the calendar requires a supplementary ceremony. I have stopped trying to find the pattern and have started simply receiving whatever morning brings, which is easier and more accurate and probably what I should have done from the beginning. What she does when she comes has changed, in ways I have been watching accumulate since the 3rd month of the temporary posting. In the beginning, she came to confirm. That was what the visits were, a function of confirmation. The need to read the instrument and receive the reading. She would stand in the doorway and look at me, and the look would complete something she was checking, and then she would go inside. As the weeks passed, the confirmation function remained, but something accumulated alongside it. The way sediment accumulates in still water slowly, without drama, in a continuous deposition that you don't notice in any single moment, but that changes the character of the bottom over time. She asks questions now that are not checking questions. She asked me last week whether I had been to the Northern Corridor territories before the transit hub posting, and when I said I had, she asked what the weather was like, and I told her. And she listened the way she listens to things that are not directly operational, with the same attention she gives to everything, but directed somewhere more interior than the usual. She had read something, she said, about the Northern Territories' transitional season. She had not been there. She had not been many places. This was said without complaint, as a simple fact, because she did not say things as complaints when they were facts, and she appeared to understand the difference clearly. I told her about the transitional season in the north, the specific quality of the cold that comes when the continental weather systems converge, which is different from the cold in the eastern corridor in ways that are difficult to articulate but unmistakable to experience. The way the sky in that region changes color at the end of the afternoon. A blue-gray that I have not seen in any other latitude I've stood a post in. The relay station's windows, which faced west, which gave me that blue-gray every afternoon for 11 days, which was the only thing I was grateful to the relay station for. She listened. She asked 2 or 3 questions. Then she went inside, and the corridor settled back into its mid-morning quiet, and I turned to face the passage and stood the post. The conversations do not last long. The Citadel's protocol and the residential wing's operational structure and the particular constraints of this suite within that structure do not allow for long conversations at the anteroom threshold. And I do not think she is looking for long conversations. I think she is looking for the thing that conversations contain, which is something I have found harder to name the longer I have been here, because it is the kind of thing that gets harder to name the more familiar it becomes. She had not, as far as I understood it, had many conversations of this kind. The suite's staff communicated with her in the register of professional service informative, attentive, efficient, and bounded by the distances that professional service requires. The Citadel's other residents communicated with her through the layers of protocol that governed interactions between members of the sovereign household, which was a different kind of bounded. I was neither of those. I was a corps sergeant from the integration desk who had been handed a card and had come to stand a post and had stood it without being informed of the reasons it was designed to be stood reluctantly, and who had stayed, and who was here. Whatever the threshold visits were, I was the available recipient of them, and I had been here for 11 months, and the mornings had accumulated the way mornings do, each one its own complete thing, and each one adding to the weight of the ones before it, and I was, as far as I could tell, going to continue being here for as long as the post was mine to stand. This morning Mira came to the threshold after the ceremony at the usual mid-morning hour, when the corridor traffic had dropped and the residential wing was in its post-riot quiet. She stood in the doorway in the formal day dress she wears for the afternoon obligations, her hair pinned in the residential style. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the light stripe on the floor, which was halfway across the stone by that hour, moving on its morning trajectory the way it always moved. She had been standing there long enough that I expected she was going to do the thing she sometimes does, where she stands and observes the corridor and goes back inside without saying anything, because the standing is the thing and not the speaking. I had my weight settled into the post the way it settles after 11 months of the same position in the same place, which is differently from how it settles after a week or a month with less conscious effort and more structural memory. The body having learned the geometry of the thing and stopped requiring instruction. Then she said, "Are you going anywhere?" She said it the way she says things that are not actually questions, with the quality of someone who has been monitoring something for a long time and wants once more, finally, to have the reading confirmed in spoken form, not because she doubted the reading, not because the instrument had given her any indication of a change, but because some things need to be said to be fully real, and this was one of them. 17 years of post-work teaches you the difference between a question that is looking for information and a question that is looking for something else. This was a question that was looking for the thing it already knew. It wanted confirmation, not discovery. It wanted the sentence spoken out loud where both of us could hear it, in the eastern anteroom, with the light halfway across the floor, and Sola moving in the inner suite and the ventilation duct ticking through its morning sequence. "No, Highness," I said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the light on the floor. She looked at me standing at the post in the right of the doorframe, back to the wall, face to the passage, the same position I had taken on the first morning and every morning since. "Good," she said. She went back inside. The door closed. The corridor was quiet, and the morning continued its ordinary unfolding, the light moving across the stone, the suite settling into its mid-morning operations. Dea's footsteps in the passage as she went about the second half of her morning duties. The ventilation duct finished its expansion sequence and went still. Outside the narrow window, the sky was the pale winter blue of the short season, the kind of light that is clear without being bright. I thought about the Wednesday morning in the administrative block 10 months ago. The solvent smell and barracks flat expression and the card with its 3 lines. Third daughter's residential suite. Dawn Wright ceremonial guard. Report 900. I thought about the walk across the compound on that first morning, arriving 4 minutes early, finding the anteroom smaller and plainer than I had expected, finding the stone benches and the narrow window and the closed door and no senior keeper, and standing at the entrance for 3 minutes counting my breath before I moved to the right of the doorframe and set my feet and faced the corridor and waited. I thought about 28 mornings of standing the post before anyone in the suite acknowledged me as something other than ambient furniture. I thought about Dea and the careful words she used to draw the map of the exit and how I had absorbed the information without recognizing what it was for. because I was not looking for an exit. I thought about the morning the ceremony ran long, and Mira appeared in the doorway in the ceremonial robe, with her hair loose, and said, "You are still here," in the voice of someone, reading an instrument they had been watching for nearly a month. "Stand guard," she had said. "Do not go." I had not gone. I had not been going to go. I had not known. On the morning she said it. What it would mean to still be there 11 months later, with the cuff embroidery and the morning cup and the full briefing and all the rest of it. I had not known because I had not been thinking about what anything would mean later. I had been standing the post in front of me the way I had been standing posts for 17 years, which is the only way I know how to stand them, which is all the way, with everything I have, for as long as the post is mine. The post is mine. I turned to face the corridor and set my hands and settled my weight into the familiar geometry of the position and looked out at the passage and the morning light and the quiet residential wing going about its mid-morning operations. I stood guard.